Greetings, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon from whichever part of the world you belong to. Welcome to the 53rd session of the online Optom Learning Series. And I would like to take this opportunity to wish all the Indian attendees a very happy Independence Day. Today is 15th August, and today is the 74th Independence Day for India. So I would like to take this opportunity to wish all the Indian attendees a very happy Independence Day. Without further ado, let me introduce to you our speaker for today. Today we have Dr. Chinmay. Dr. Chinmay is a retinal surgeon from Mumbai. He has underwent his training at the prestigious Shankara Netralaya Hospital in Chennai. He has also worked as a consultant ophthalmologist at Arvind Eye Hospital, Pondicherry. He was also the director of retinal services at the Aditya Jyot Eye Hospital, Mumbai. Currently, he practices at his own clinic, which is named as Elsevier Eye Clinic at Shivaji Park, Mumbai, and is also associated with a lot of eye hospitals and clinic in and out Mumbai for his retinal consultation. His keen interests are in retinal surgeries, especially the diabetic retinas. And as an ophthalmologist, as a doctor, he believes that he needs to provide his patients an holistic solution for the visual needs. And with this take-home message, the aim of today's session, what is going to talk to us, is about the retinal eye disease, specifically for diabetic retinopathy. What are the risk factors? How do we go about looking, and how do we know that the eye has diabetic retinopathy changes? So I welcome you, Dr. Chinmay. Thank you very much for taking out this time, and I will leave the screen time to you now.
Yes, thank you, Fakruddin, for this excellent organizing this excellent session, and a very happy Independence Day to all the participants who are from India, and generally good day to everybody else. So, what we are going to generally talk about is diabetes. Now, why is this so interesting? Because it is mostly, see, what is diabetes? It's basically an inability of your body to process glucose. This increases the blood glucose level, and when the glucose in the blood rises, there are certain chemical reactions which happen, which cause certain damages to the smaller blood vessels. Smaller blood vessels especially are important in certain end organs. Now, what are end organs? End organs are organ systems which have one big artery supplying them, and then they branch out into arterioles, capillaries, etc. So if there is any problem in the blood circulation of that particular artery, then the function of that whole organ goes for a toss. So what we know is there are few organs like the kidneys, the nerves, the skin, the heart, which are more prone for such diabetic damages. And especially as eye care professionals, the eye, especially the retina of the eye, also can be affected due to diabetes. Now, what happens is this diabetic retinopathy, as we call it, can be a blinding condition. It can be permanent. And interestingly, there are certain ways, because of the ease with which we can examine the retina, there are certain strategies in which you can actually prevent vision loss from diabetic retinopathy. So today's talk is going to be focused on that. Very quickly, I will brief you through the risk factors for diabetes. Then we'll go through per se what happens in diabetic retinopathy, how do we diagnose it, what all tools do we deploy to diagnose it, and what are the treatment options for the same. After this, if there are any questions, I think we'll be more than happy to answer them. So as we know, in India and especially the Southeast Asian region, unfortunately, we are at the epicenter of this whole epidemic. Now we are in the middle of a COVID epidemic, but we should also know that diabetes is also reaching epidemic proportions. The projected increase in diabetes in the next 10 to 20 years is humongous. So what happens is at this point of time, it doesn't just remain a health problem; it becomes a public health problem. So it is estimated that by 2040, 1 in 10 adults will have diabetes. There's a large amount of money of global health expenditure spent on diabetes. and as much as every 6 seconds a person dies from diabetes or related death. So that's quite a humongous health burden. So what are the risk factors for diabetes, diabetic retinopathy as such? These we will just very quickly rush through, because per se we would not be treating any of these in our practice, but it's always important to know, because when a person walks into your OPD, when you're taking a history for that person, you need to know all his relevant systemic parameters also. So the prime risk factor of diabetic retinopathy is the duration of diabetes. The longer the duration of diabetes, the more time the blood vessels have to undergo the metabolic stresses of raised blood sugars, and so increase in the chances of diabetic retinopathy. Then if you are poorly controlled, there are studies for all of this also. Yeah. So the duration of diabetes, like I said, then the glycemic control, poorly controlled and long duration diabetes, such people have a high chance of running into eye complications. Then hypertension, along with diabetes, hypertension also affects the smaller blood vessels of the body. So both of these things might act in coalition and they might damage your retina. So this is also important to take a history of hypertension. Uh, there are studies which say that if you have a tight control of blood sugar, blood pressure, your end organ damage can actually be minimized. Dyslipidemia, what does this mean? This means that there's a disarray in the lipid profile, especially your low density lipoprotein. For those of you who are familiar with retinal examination, you might also notice that in people who have a deranged lipid profile, there are a large number of these yellowish deposits that you see in the retina. These, we call them as hard exudates. They are nothing but lipoprotein deposits in the retina, and they can actually be counterproductive for your vision. The deposits can actually damage the photoreceptor cells of your retina, and they might lead to permanent loss in vision. So dyslipidemia again is a risk factor. Pregnancy, well, yes, in pregnancy, because of the hormonal changes that happen, especially in the first 3 months, the first trimester, there might be a rapid progression of diabetic retinopathy. So you need to keep a close watch on ladies who already have some amount of diabetic retinopathy and they get pregnant. Nephropathy, well, yes, this is again another organ which has like a end artery. So it is said that people with diabetic retinopathy, there might be some amount of nephropathy, at least some microalbuminuria or grade 1 diabetic nephropathy present. So you need to keep a watch on this. As easily as you can examine the retina of the eye, you cannot examine the kidney so easily. So you need to keep a watch on the nephropathy, because if you just keep on examining the eye and telling the patient that, you know, look, it's all fine, but he might actually develop some amount of kidney problems, and if you don't refer him in time, he might lose those kidneys, and then undergoing a dialysis or a kidney transplant it really wreaks havoc with your quality of life. Okay, so then in clinical practice, sometimes we do see patients who, despite having a very poor control of diabetes, they never develop diabetic retinopathy. Now, and some people who, despite having actually a reasonably good control, have a very rapidly progressive course of diabetic retinopathy. So you might consider genetics to be some playing some part in this. An interesting thing is the Asian Indian phenotype. Now, apparently, in people of South Asian descent or Indian descent, what happens is we would be generally skinny. I mean, we would not have a typical sort of an obese, uh, body, but we would deposit fat mostly along our midline and along the our internal organ. This is known as visceral fat. So this is also important uh, because it causes a lot of insulin resistance, and this is right now coming across as one of the major risk factors for developing diabetes. You might not be a very fat overweight individual, you might be a thin person, but if you have a lot of midline obesity or fat deposits, the insulin which is supposed to act might not act. It might not push the sugars inside your blood cells, so the blood sugar rises and they cause all the ill effects of diabetes. Same thing. Yes. So coming to the eye, now Well, yes, diabetes can cause a lot of things in a lot of organs, but what really happens in the eye? What are the effects of diabetes on the eye? So there can be early development of cataract. We have seen this. Sometimes what happens is, even if there might not be too much of a clinically evident cataract, but there might be a large fluctuation in the refraction of patients, sudden fluctuation because of these osmotic cataracts. Once the blood sugar level increases and it reaches inside the lens, then it attracts a lot of water because of the carbohydrate, because the chemical nature of carbohydrates, and that water inside the lens might induce some cataract or at least change the refractive error of the eye. So that is something you need to keep in mind. The second thing is diabetic retinopathy. This affects the blood vessels and the back of the eye. Now, what happens is, because of a chronic increase in blood sugar, the inner lining of the smallest blood vessels, it becomes very thick. So there is no oxygen which comes out of the capillaries. When there is no oxygen that comes out of the capillaries, the tissues do not get enough oxygen. So they secrete certain chemicals known as vascular endothelial growth factor. Now it's not just VEGF. There are many other chemicals, but VEGF is one of the prime chemicals. Now this chemical will cause all the effects of diabetes. It might cause the first clinical sign of diabetes is a microaneurysm, the small red dots that you see on the surface of the retina. I will show you pictures, but those are the first signs. So as the hypoxia, the decrease in oxygen goes on increasing, the area of the retina which is not getting oxygen goes on increasing, then the grade of diabetic retinopathy also goes on progressing. A second thing is diabetic macular edema. Diabetic macular edema means, in layman's terms, it is a swelling in the central area of the retina. The central area of the retina is very, very important for your fine vision, your reading, writing vision, or if you're identifying a person, his features, his eyes, that's because your macula is healthy. If the macula develops some amount of swelling, then the vision goes down immediately and it's of immediate consequence. Diabetic retinopathy in the periphery might not cause any loss of vision. There might be 6 by 6 vision also, but even a small change in the center of the retina will lead to loss of vision. So you need to understand the concept of diabetic macular edema. So what happens, like I explained to you, in the early stages, uh, there are just a few. Can you see the screen? If you see the screen, this is the left eye, because this is the disc, this is the center of the retina, this is the macula. And if you see these small red spots over here, in just one quadrant primarily, over this quadrant, so those are known as microaneurysms. This is called as a mild non-proliferative diabetic retinopathy. So in this stage, the patient's vision will be very good because his central retina is all fine, but he does have a process going on over here. He does have retinopathy going on. So his retina is not normal. Even though his vision is good, his retina is not normal. As the level of hypoxia increases, the changes appear in many more quadrants. They appear in almost 2 quadrants in this photo, that is known as moderate NPDR. In severe NPDR, almost all the quadrants are affected. So there is a 4:2:1 rule, if you've heard about it. So 4 quadrants of dot and blot hemorrhages, 2 quadrants of venous bleeding, and 1 quadrant of IRMA. So at least 2 of this, if it is present, 2 or more, then you can call it as severe NPDR. And this is called as CSME. Now, CSME means what? It means clinically significant macular edema. Now, what is clinically significant? When this term was coined, in the 1980s. So in the 1980s, you did not have any OCT, you did not have any of the fancy instruments that we have today. So clinically significant means if you can examine the patient on a 90D or a 78D, you need to pick up that there is macular edema in these patients. Even before you do an OCT, you need to pick up. So that is the meaning of clinically significant macular edema. So there are again things, there are guidelines how to diagnose this. When you look at it through a 90D or a 78D, you're looking binocularly, so there is some depth perception. So you will be able to make out whether the retina is flat or the retina is thickened. So if there is any thickening of the central retina within 500 microns of the center of the retina, then you have to call it clinically significant macular edema. Okay, this is another series of slides which shows the progression of diabetic retinopathy. Now, if you see this slide, it's a picture of the right eye. The patient seems to be having a little bit of cataract. Media is hazy. In some cases, we cannot really comment on the grade of diabetic retinopathy. At such a point, an angiography is a very good tool. In angiography, if you see, there are a lot of these hyperfluorescent spots. If you see, these are known as, these whitish spots are known as hyperfluorescent spots. These are nothing but microaneurysms which are showing up much better on a angiography as compared to a clinical picture. And this signifies around mild non-proliferative disease. Over here, even clinically, you can see that the number of spots and the number of these yellowish spots, which are also known as hard exudates, are seen in uh, a few more quadrants of the retina. Correspondingly, if you do an angiography, you will see that yes, it does correspond to a lot of microaneurysms in almost all the quadrants of the retina. This is a severe disease. Correspondingly, you see, a severe angiogram. And now coming to the proliferative stage. So until the non-proliferative stage, it is not visually threatening. You can still follow up the patient. You can be like, okay, you have some amount of changes in your eye. If you do not watch your sugars, it can be dangerous. But right now, you do not need treatment. That's what you tell him. But if you manage to classify a patient as a proliferative diabetic retinopathy, then that is an emergency situation because such a patient will lose vision. And if you do not refer him in time, sometimes the vision loss might be permanent. So, timing is very critical. Early diagnosis and early treatment is of prime importance. So, everybody, all eye care professionals need to be very familiar with how a proliferative diabetic retinopathy would look like. Okay, so a proliferative retinopathy, if you see a if a relative or a patient sends you a fundus photo and you do see a big patch of blood on top of the retina, these are not intraretinal hemorrhages, these are pre-retinal hemorrhages. Then more often than not, this person has a proliferative diabetic retinopathy. Okay, this would show as these lacy hyperfluorescent areas on an angiography. These are venous loopings or beadings, and these are neovascularization. This is what we call as NVE. Now these are very ominous blood vessels. They might rupture at any point of time. If they rupture, they cause a lot of bleeding inside the vitreous jelly of the eye. This is called as vitreous hemorrhage, and this might lead to a sudden and a very profound drop in vision. Okay, so this has to be picked up. This again, if you see, there is a large patch of hemorrhage over here. This is premacular hemorrhage. So this person's vision is going to be very, very low, almost to the level of hand movements or finger counting or something. And some cases of asteroid hyalosis. Now, I'm sure all of you all know what asteroid hyalosis is. These are small calcium crystals floating around in the vitreous jelly of the eye. So sometimes it's a little difficult to make out what is happening in the retina because the media is quite hazy. So in such cases, you should definitely do an angiography. And luckily, we did an angiography in this case. If you see a lot of lacy hyperfluorescence around the disc, this is known as NVD. This is known as NVE, and these black spots are what are known as non-perfusion areas. This is where the blood is not reaching, and that is the reason why all these new vessels are being formed on the retina. Okay, this is another case of high risk PDR where there is a pre-retinal hemorrhage. Another case of tractional retinal detachment. If you see such fibrosis, white colored patches on the surface of the retina, white colored scars on the surface of the retina, in technical terms, we call it as a fibrovascular proliferation or an FVP. And these are again bad things because if they happen in the center of the retina, they might pull across your macula and they will cause again a very profound loss of vision. These are a few cases of proliferative retinopathy. Coming to clinically significant macular edema, yes, that's how it would look like. So there are these leaking spots. They are very close to the center of the retina. So if you laser this in time, if you treat these leakages in time, then you can actually prevent this swelling from spreading to the center. So you can prevent this person from going blind. So it's important to diagnose this. This person unfortunately has a very large area of macular edema and a neovascularization on the disc, so he would require laser along with some injections. I will explain that to you later. Okay, and then there's a case of advanced diabetic eye disease. These are typically patients who are very poor systemically. They have a lot of uncontrolled sugars, kidney problems, heart problems. The diabetes generally affects all systems of the body, and the retina is detached from multiple places, and there is a large sheet of scar tissue on the surface of the retina. So these would typically require surgical treatments. In a few cases, even complicated patients we can manage very effectively. There have been a few cases which we have operated and they've come back to actually 6/6 after losing almost all their vision. So that's a superb thing, because now we have all these techniques and all these machines by which we can operate and give them pretty accurate results. But prevention is always better than cure. So if you catch a person early and you treat him in time and he is maintaining whatever vision he has to maintain, that's always a preferable thing to do. This is one of the slides which I tell people that, look, right now you're seeing fine, but if your diabetic retinopathy progresses, this is how your vision will be. So you better take care of your sugars, otherwise you're in for trouble. So once you show them pictures and all, people are a little more, visual or graphic forms of learning are always more effective. So that brings us to retinal screening. Now, since most of y'all, I think that poll tells us that y'all are students or y'all are practitioners, this particular thing becomes very important. I mean, we need to spend some time on retinal screening and why do we screen? What are the objectives in screening? Now, what you need to understand is there are a lot of patients who come to me that, Doctor, look, I went and I visited a lot of opticians in my area and they checked my vision and they just gave me glasses. I could read the smallest possible line. So I think I'm fine. I do not have any diabetic retinopathy, but that is a big misconception. Everybody needs to understand this, that even if you have severe diabetic retinopathy or even if you have proliferative forms of diabetic retinopathy, if your macula is fine, then you will have 6/6 vision. That does not mean that your retina is okay. That means that you can go blind any moment. You might have a sudden drop of vision. So if you're a diabetic, every year, at least once a year, you should be screened by your eye care professional. You should have a retinal examination, not just a vision checkup. A vision checkup is important, obviously, but you should also have a retinal examination. And why do we screen? Because diabetic retinopathy does not directly progress to the blindness stage. It shows a linear progression. It goes through the mild, moderate, severe, very severe stage. So if you catch a person who's in the mild stage and you tell him that, look, I've taken a photo of your eye and you seem to be having this disease, your vision is good, I'll give you glasses, but if you do not take care, maybe you might go blind. If you educate him properly, that patient is more motivated to come back to you and check the retinal status maybe 6 months later or a week later. And overall, this helps in reducing the burden of preventable blindness in the society. And why do we screen again? Do we have a treatment? See, if we are screening, we should be able to treat it. So yes, we do have effective treatments. If we do effective lasers on time, if we give injections on time, in some cases, if we operate on time, we can restore a good amount of vision. Patients can actually do all things that they do and have a very good quality of life. So basically, we screen so that a patient who is diabetic can maintain his quality of life the way he wants to. The second question is, can a vision loss due to diabetes be prevented? Yes, that's what we answered right now. So if you treat in time, if you catch a person in time, if you treat in time, we can very well prevent vision loss due to diabetes. Can vision be regained after it is lost? Well, this you have to be very clear. In some cases, it might not be recoverable. For example, if a person of advanced diabetic eye disease has a very badly detached retina, or he has glaucoma, which is neovascular glaucoma, very common with people with diabetes. So if that happens, even after you operate or do whatever treatments you have to do, I don't think you can expect the level of vision which was there before he lost it. So in a few cases, yes, we can reverse the loss of vision. If it's a vitreous hemorrhage, if it's a peripheral tractional detachment, if it's an epiretinal membrane, retinal surgeries can very well treat this. If it's a simple cataract by which he has lost his vision, then he can regain it, yes. But retinal causes or nerve causes of blindness and diabetes unfortunately cannot be regained. So that has to be drilled very carefully into the patients. Now, how do we screen? Well, primarily the retinal doctor examines. We dilate the eye, we put dilating drops, and once the pupil dilates, we see them. Clinical examination would be considered the gold standard right now. So if you are not eye care doctor, if you're not a retina specialist, can you still screen? Well, yes, very effectively you can screen, and you can pick up visually threatening diabetic retinopathy and refer them. So there are some of these devices which we have. These are tabletop cameras. Some of them have non-mydriatic modes also. So you don't need to put drops. If you put drops, you get a better image. But even if you don't put drops, you can still get a good image. Especially, I do not have any financial interest in this, but I'm particularly interested by the Zeiss Claris. This is quite an expensive camera, but it does a beautiful job. Now, if you see this whole thing, 135 degrees of image of the retina is captured in a non-mydriatic mode. Okay, so if you dilate, it goes right up to 170 odd, so almost up to the aura. So typically a patient can come and just get his fundus photo clicked, and you just see the photo. If you've got some retinopathy, well, yes, you diagnose that you have some retinopathy. If you don't, well, you come back 6 months later. We just keep screening you. If you develop something new, we'll tell you what is there. But yeah, so this is just a comparison. This is a Claris 135-degree single image, and that is how a conventional fundus photo would capture. A conventional photo fundus camera would capture only this much. A Claris wide field would capture all the peripheral details also. So it gives certain advantages. So this is another Claris image. So it shows, this is not a diabetic retinopathy, but this is a retinal tear which has been lasered by me, and it shows the peripheral laser marks. So it's good to educate the patient that this is what we've done. So there are a few other non-mydriatic cameras also, like I said. So a few of them have been devised by companies in India, so they are a little cost effective because okay. So these are the advantages of your tabletop cameras. They have a good field, a decent field of vision in non-mydriatic, but they are bulky, they're office based, they're costly, angiography and all cannot be done, and the quality of images, well, it's not as good as a Claris or something, but at least you have something with you. A second revolutionary device. Now, this has come into vogue since the last, I would say, some 7, 8 years maybe. Initially, there was a company, Swedish company called Pictor, which had this particular device, which is there on your screen. Then Vogue took it over. So, this device, you just put it on the patient's eye and you click it. It's like a gun, and the images are stored inside the device, and then you connect a USB cable, take it on your laptop, and then you can access it from there. I've used this device. It looks fantastic, but then it requires a little bit of a learning curve. It's not very easy to take pictures, and obviously in poor media, cataracts and everything, it's not a very easy thing to handle. But it's still there. There are people who have been used to this device and they're using it. So if you are in a setup where you do not have too many other things, and it's like an individual small practice or something, you can think of investing in a handheld device. This will help you to capture the fundus images. You can tie up with a doctor whom you're familiar with, and then just send the images. And there is I think, a very established platform for, or a established thing about teleconsultation. You can, like, no doctor can send you a report saying that this does show some problems or this does not show some problems. So if it's a referable form of diabetic retinopathy, then you do refer it. If it's a non-referable form of diabetic retinopathy, well, then you just call him maybe 6-8 months or maybe a year later. Yeah, now this is an interesting innovation from an Indian company. The name of the company is Remedio, and I've also used this device personally. So what they have done is they have done some R&D with an iPhone camera. I think I have an iPhone 6s. I mean, the ones they've given me is an iPhone 6s. So all of your phone cameras, no, they typically have an infrared filter. So what these guys have done is they have removed the infrared filter and they've synced the camera flash along with the instrument flash. So what happens is once you place the patient in front of your camera, there is a live view. You can actually see what you are clicking. You can focus. You can use the phone's autofocus to focus the image, and then you can click it. And the advantage is it comes on an iPhone. So it's the sharing these images as a PDF or as a report or everything becomes very easy. Yeah, so that's how the device looks like. It's like a handheld device, and this is the patient end. This is where the doctor sits, and this is the R&D whatever they've done. The infrared image, the live view looks like this, and the moment you touch the camera button, it sends a small flash and it captures a central portion of the retina. Okay, now with this again, at first go, it might not be very easy to operate, but with a certain amount of practice, you can actually capture pretty decent images of the retina. I typically capture around 4 images of the retina in each eye, and the software which these guys have given, it stitches those images together. It's called a montage. So it gives like a quite a decent image. I would say around 50 to 60 degrees of retinal field is seen in those images and details are captured. So, well, yes, it is very effective, and it's almost 1/5 or 1/4 the price of your normal fundus camera. This reduces the amount of expertise needed for actually diagnosing diabetic retinopathy and picking up diabetic retinopathy. So even if somebody who's a student, who's a first year student, you train him. If he's good at photography, you send him for a camp or you send him somewhere, and he lines up 50 diabetic patients. He takes a picture of all of them. The software will still tell him that there are 3 patients out of 5 who are diabetic retinopathy and you need to refer it. So that's still doable. These software are always compared with gold standard, and there are studies which happen in validation of these software. So before you use any software, you need to ask certain questions to the provider, that is this software validated, and if it's a validated software, then these are excellent tools to pick up diabetic retinopathy in the community. So this is a slide which has been given to me by Remedio. They have published their findings in JAMA Ophthalmology, and I think they've come up with pretty decent results. These are the advantages and the disadvantages. I think we just discussed this. And these are some of the images. These are the images of fundus on phone, which is the Remedio camera, and this is the Zeiss camera. If you see head to head, I think it does a pretty decent job. It's not very bad. The field of vision, like if you see this image, well, this field of vision is obviously smaller than the Zeiss one, but at least referable forms of diabetic retinopathy, it is picking up. So that's one of the more exciting things about diabetic retinopathy and technology where we are today, that we can actually click a photo of the deeper structures of the eye by just having 1 or 2 devices with us. And as competition increases, as many companies enter into the fray, the cost of all these devices will go down, and for healthcare providers is always an advantageous situation. See, this is the device, and the company also gives this dismantleable stand, so this makes it much more easier, because once the patient's chin is fixed over there, then he does not move, and it's very easy to take a picture, and you get decent quality pictures with this Remedio phone. Now, what is the treatment? Can it be treated? Well, yes, diabetic retinopathy in treatable stages can be very well treated. you can halt its progression, you can prevent unnecessary blindness. So that is why diabetic retinopathy is one of the the reasons of preventable blindness. So you can prevent this by effective screening and treatment. And lasers, retinal lasers are one of the prime modes of treatment of diabetic retinopathy. This is not a surgery. This is done in the OPD typically. We dilate the patient, we put him on a slit lamp, and we give some laser. Laser is nothing but light of a particular wavelength. So when that light goes inside the retina of the eye, we use certain lens which we keep on top of the patient's cornea, and through that we focus the retinal light onto the microaneurysm, and we ablate or we burn off that microaneurysm so that it stops leaking. So once it stops leaking, the swelling in the retina also reduces, and that's how the patient's vision loss can be prevented. Okay, so there are different types of laser. The same laser, you can do multiple things with it. So around the macula, sometimes if there are a lot of microaneurysms like this, we give laser spots to each and every microaneurysm. These are known as focal. This is known as a focal laser because you're just focusing on a particular microaneurysm and then just inactivating it. Sometimes we give a grid laser like this. What a grid laser does, it gently stimulates the retinal pigment epithelium, which is like the deeper layer of the retina. So it just gives it a little bit of a tickle so that it starts pumping the fluid back from the retina to the choroid, and the retina becomes a little dry. Okay, so these grayish spots are typically how fresh laser marks would look like, and once they become mature, they acquire some pigmentation and they look a little darker like this. Okay, and in cases of proliferative diabetic retinopathy, where there are new vessels and where there's a risk of hemorrhage and sudden drop of vision due to bleeding, we do something known as pan-retinal photocoagulation. So this is not done in the center of the retina. This is done in the periphery of the retina. So multiple spots are given in the center and the periphery of the retina. So if you remember, I told you that there are certain chemicals which are secreted which cause this diabetic retinopathy. The more important one among them is called a vascular endothelial growth factor, VEGF. So that is secreted from the diseased retina, the retina which is not getting enough oxygen. So what laser does is it inactivates the diseased retina. So once it inactivates the diseased retina stops secreting VEGF. So at least whatever stage of diabetic retinopathy is there, it does not progress any further. At least that is the logic by which we apply laser. Okay, so multiple settings are generally required, and this laser is non-negotiable. The patient does not have an option. If he says that I will not do this laser, then the only thing is his diabetic retinopathy will progress and he will go blind. This is not like a LASIK laser which is done to take care of the refractive error or something. This is a therapeutic laser, and it's absolutely essential to do it. Otherwise, the retinopathy progresses relentlessly until it causes blindness. So this is the earlier the laser done, the better it is for the patients who have proliferative disease. In the mature stages, this is how a typical lasered retina would look like. Then again, coming to macular edema. Now, all of you, lasers are something which we used to do, 10, maybe 15 years back. This was like the prime thing, lasers. But since the last decade or so, intravitreal injections have been the mainstay of treatment. Now, these are fantastic things because what these do is the laser will at least destroy those leaking microaneurysms. Injections do not destroy them. Injections act on a very biological level. Now, whatever level of chemicals are more in the retina, you are giving an antibody to those injections. So, the common injections are Avastin, Eccentrix, Eylea. So, these are anti-VEGF injections. So, once you give these injections, the the level of circulating uh, chemicals in the vitreous of the eye actually go down. So that leads to an immediate increase in vision. So if there is a macular edema, like you see the picture on the left side, and you give a couple of injections of Avastin, and bingo, the retina is absolutely dry. The patient might actually come from, let's say, 6 by 60 to 6 by 6 in a matter of days. He has that wow sort of an effect that, oh, doctor, no, I couldn't read. Now I can read almost everything. But the flip side to this is these are not permanent solutions. Okay, there is no injection which is permanent. Even if you give a more expensive injection, or if you give a steroid injection, it is not permanent. It has a half-life. It gets cleared from the vitreous, and you still have to keep on giving these injections. To that effect, we have this implant in the eye, Ozurdex implant. What is Ozurdex? It is dexamethasone. We have always been giving steroids inside the eye for a very long time, and this implant, what it does is it slowly releases dexamethasone inside the vitreous, and around 700 micrograms every day it releases, and it releases this at least for 3 to 4 months. So once you give this for 3-4 months, the patient is absolutely okay. There is no recurrence of edema, as compared to Avastin, which may have to be given monthly. The only disadvantage would be that you have to see if the patient has a cataract or not. If the patient has a cataract, well, you might want to avoid Ozurdex. If the patient has already undergone a cataract surgery, then this is one of the best injections to do. Then comes surgery for diabetic retinopathy. Now, these are very few people actually require surgery. If they are well controlled diabetics with mild, moderate, severe, uh, none of them require surgery. If they have proliferative disease, and let's say one of you guys catches them in time, and then say refer them for a laser, and they are treated in time, and they maintain good sugars and all, they also might not require surgery. But there are a few who, despite doing all these things, might eventually bleed. They have vitreous hemorrhage. Then they have these fibrous membranes on the surface of the retina which are pulling the retina from each and every side, and they are causing retinal traction and retinal detachment. So these are not going to be relieved by laser. These things are not going to be relieved by intravitreal injections. These definitely need surgery inside the eye, and this surgery is called a vitrectomy. Now, initially, a vitrectomy used to be done with big incisions. We used to apply stitches or sutures to the surface of the eye. But these days, we do not apply any suture. The patient comes with a white eye. He goes home with a white eye. The next day, if you see him, you wouldn't even realize that he's undergone a major complicated retinal procedure, because the eye just looks fine. Everything is all good. So internally, he actually might start seeing very clearly the next day. But from externally, you might not notice maybe a small subconjunctival hemorrhage or something. But the rehabilitation these days is pretty quick, even after major surgeries. So these are few of the cases I think that I've operated. If you see this particular image, this is what is known as a vitreomacular traction. So this fibrous membrane is pulling on the retina, and it is causing this tractional detachment and some edema over here. So we do a surgery and we just chop off this membrane, we peel off all the things from the surface of the retina, and over a period of time the retina does settle, and obviously the patient's vision is also restored with this. Yeah, so those are 23 gauge systems, and that's how it looks inside the eye. There's a big hemorrhage, if you can see. That's a vitrectomy which is going on. These are microscopic instruments which are there. Not microscopic really, but then these are 23 gauge instruments. The smallest we can go is 27 gauge, which is like a very thin instrument, and that's the hemorrhage which is being cleared from the surface of the eye, and eventually the retina underneath will be repaired, and this patient did get a decent amount of vision back, even after losing almost everything after a hemorrhage.
Okay, so thank you first of all, Dr. Chinmay, for sharing a lot of information in terms of assessing for diabetic retinopathy and what are the stages, and also we learned about when should you refer, how should you refer, when should you not refer, and how should you manage. As most of us here are optometrists, we are primary eye care practitioners, so when the patient walks into our practice, I think whether we are placed in an optical setup or an ophthalmology clinic, as an optometrist, it is a very important role. When we look at the fundus, we should be able to pick up these early signs, as you may keep on mentioning that early signs are very important to pick up, and referring the patient accordingly. So thank you for doing this talk. Dr. Chinmay, just wanted to show you that this is how vitrectomy is done, and it's not as it used to be before, that cut open the eye. It's just a small incision which gets things done, right? So So yes, Dr. Chinmay, there is a first question in terms of vitrectomy. So except vitrectomy, do you think that there are any other options for VMTS?
Yes. So, in very interesting question by whoever Anil, I cannot see his full name.
Anil Yadav.
Anil Yadav. Yeah, that's a very interesting question because there was a pharmacological treatment for VMT. There was a drug which you injected in the eye, and that could actually, reduce the VMT. It would relieve the VMT because it dissolved the vitreous and everything. It was called ocriplasmin. It's basically a vitreolytic, but unfortunately, it never really took up. It was not very effective because people with ocriplasmin, they had a lot of floaters. There was an increased risk of detachment in them, and the cost of ocriplasmin was prohibitively high. It was almost 4 times the cost of a vitrectomy. So, and you could just use it once. So, despite being available, it never really took off. If it's not doing the job, if it's not working as well as something which is a gold standard, then it doesn't really replace what the gold standard is. So, yes, there was an option, but right now it is not there. It's not even there in the market.
Okay.
Yeah.
And coming to the next questions, there are certain patients who have normal blood sugar levels. However, their HbA1c levels are elevated.
Yeah.
So, which of the two is a reliable factor to screen for patients in diabetic retinopathy? What's your take on this?
See, your sugar levels and HbA1c levels now will just give you an idea of the long-term sugar control. For diabetic retinopathy, primarily you need to see the retina. So if your sugar level is okay, but the HbA1c level is high, obviously the long-term control of that patient is not very good. So you need to refer that patient back to his primary care physician to actually adjust his dosages and all, because typically before they go for a test, many people fast for 2-3 days and then they get their blood sugars tested. So these are very common things. When they check the blood sugar, it is always low because before doing that they eat properly, they fast properly. But if the HbA1c is high, it means that the long-term sugar control is not good. And if HbA1c is high, then that person has a much more chance of progressing his diabetic retinopathy than a person who's always been maintaining a normal HbA1c.
Okay. Which is the better treatment for PRP or anti-VEGF? Which is the better treatment? Doing
I think this is one of the things where we customize it. There is no better or worse treatment. PRP, I am guessing the question by Astha is aimed at a proliferative retinopathy. So for proliferative retinopathy, right now we stick to PRP. There are a few studies which say that instead of doing laser, you only give anti-VEGF even in a proliferative retinopathy case. But that is not practical in at least our Indian scenario. One, because of the cost of treatment, it would escalate like anything. Secondly, anti-VEGF are associated with a small risk of intraocular infection also, or some amount of cardiac risk is also there. So you don't want to take those unnecessary risks. PRP in good cases has a very good success rate, and that would still be my treatment of choice for a proliferative retinopathy. Coming to macular edema, if there is a macular edema, then I definitely prefer anti-VEGF.
And apart from the orthodox, possibly including a cat, are there any side effects of using orthodox implants? So
Yeah,
any
so
experience on this? Yeah.
yeah. So whenever there is a steroid injected in the eye or around the eye, there are two things primarily we look at. We look at cataract and we look at intraocular pressure. So if the patient already is a glaucoma patient, or he is a one-eyed patient, or the disc is a little suspect, or there are borderline patients, ocular hypertensives, then maybe you can skip Ozurdex. You might not consider Ozurdex. And should Ozurdex be always avoided in a phakic? Well, not really. In a few patients, in fact, who have had a cataract and they know that they will need a cataract surgery in the future, let's say a nuclear sclerosis grade 2 or something, sometimes I give them a Ozurdex because, they say, okay, fine, you give me a Ozurdex, moment my macular edema goes down, I'm anyway going to do a cataract surgery. So it's not, there are no absolutes in medicine, but there are broad guidelines as to how you should go about with your thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is it necessary to dilate patient? What if the patient is having glaucoma? Now, I think dilatation in terms of optometrist is very important as well. So, if you could
Yeah.
want to answer that.
So I think as optometrist, and I'm sure all of you all also, there are clinical ways in which we assess the anterior chamber depth. We have a von Herrichs grading, we have a torchlight examination. So if you suspect that the patient has shallow anterior chambers, or if your refraction says that he's a hyperope, there are crowding of the anterior segment or something, or he has a known history of angle closure glaucoma, well, then in those cases you might not dilate. So there are non-mydriatic cameras also. You can screen effectively with them. If a patient who has a history of angle closure glaucoma, but he's undergone a YAG iridotomy, then you go ahead and dilate. Nothing is going to happen to you.
And what if the patient is having glaucoma? Again, as you said, screening plays a very important role.
Yeah, the screening plays a role. If he's having, see, the more common form of glaucoma is a open angle glaucoma. In those patients, dilatation really doesn't matter. You can go ahead and dilate, not a problem.
Okay. A couple of more questions here, which are any comments on observing the diabetic retinopathy signs in patients who are not diabetic, but they come with some signs? So that's one of the scenario.
Very
What
good
are the
question. Aarti
causes?
Uttarkar, yeah. So what you should always see is there are some signs of diabetic retinopathy like hemorrhages on the retina or hard exudates on the retina. Essentially in diabetic retinopathy, these signs have to be present in both the eyes. They might be more in one eye, they might be less in the other eye, but they will always be present in both the eyes. So if a patient who is not diabetic and he comes with only certain signs of diabetic retinopathy in one eye, then it might not be diabetic retinopathy at all. There are other things like a branch retinal vein occlusion or a central retinal vein occlusion or a vasculitis, which might typically present with signs in one eye only. So then you're not looking at DR at all. You need to keep that in mind.
Yeah. Okay. And
Another thing what you need to understand is this, there may be some patients who are undiagnosed diabetes. So there are few patients who I have diagnosed to be diabetic after looking at their retina, because you diagnose diabetic retinopathy, you ask him to do a HbA1c and it's all over the place, 12, 13 something. So then they get diagnosed as diabetes. That also you need to keep in mind.
yeah. And I think nowadays that's quite common. We diagnosing patients having diabetic retinopathy while after looking at the fundus rather than they
Yes,
telling us that they have diabetes. It's quite
yes,
a bit
yes,
getting common that way. Yeah.
yes, yes.
Yeah. And this is again a surgical related question, but after
Yeah.
how many days after the PRP laser would you recommend to do a cataract surgery? Is there any guidelines or is there?
I don't think there is any relation between PRP and cataract. Even if you do a PRP, let's say today, tomorrow you can perform a cataract. So there are some cases in which the cataract is very very dense and we need to perform PRP. So we try doing a PRP as much as possible. But if it's not possible, we ask the patient to immediately undergo a cataract surgery. And then 1 day post cataract surgery, we can still do a PRP. In this, we do not use a contact lens, obviously, because the wound is fresh. We do a non-contact laser. It's called an indirect laser indirect laser, INO laser, so that we can do. And we can do it immediately after cataract also. So I don't think the both are related per se.
Okay. And going on to the one last question, is it possible to do PRP lasers in branch retinal vein occlusions?
Yes, we can do.
You can do. Okay. And I read some one interesting question. There is one student getting confused between what are hard and soft exudates. I know
Yeah.
it's not related directly to this, but if you could just explain
The hard
very.
exudates are typically the lipid exudates, the lipoprotein, the photos that you saw, the yellowish colored things. And the soft exudates are what we call as cotton wool spots. So those are typically seen in cases, even in diabetic you might see them, but primarily in hypertensive cases. Though the pathology of that is totally different.
Yeah, but I think thank you, Dr. Chinmay, very much for taking out the time and doing this session and giving your opinions and answering to all of our questions. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks, Fakhruddin.
We do have session tomorrow. Tomorrow is at the same time, 5:30 in the evening Indian time and 8 p.m. Evening Malaysian time. We have somebody talking on traumatic brain injury and its visual consequences. So tune in tomorrow, 5:30 Indian time, 8 p.m. Malaysian time. Until then, stay home, stay safe, and I will see you all again tomorrow. Once again, a very happy Independence Day to all Indian attendees. Stay safe. Bye-bye. Thank you, Dr. Chinmay.
Okay, bye, Fakhruddin.